I was halfway through pouring my first cup of coffee when the phone started ringing. Not buzzing, not chiming, ringing. That old landline sound that barely exists anymore, the kind that rattles through your bones because it belongs to a different era. It was 2:07 a.m. The kind of hour when you already know that if the phone rings, something's wrong. Someone's dead, or dying, or about to ruin your life with news you can't unhear. I almost didn't answer, but then I saw the area code glowing on the small screen, 757. Norfolk, Virginia, the same number that used to flash on caller ID whenever my father called from base. Back when he was alive. Back when, "I'll call you when I can, little star," meant something other than a ghost's promise. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. The coffee mug slipped. It hit the tile floor with a crack that seemed too loud for 2 a.m., ceramic exploding into a dozen pieces, dark liquid spreading like blood across the white grout. I didn't even look down. I just lifted the phone to my ear. Hello? For a few seconds, there was only static, that low, oceanic hum like the sound of a seashell pressed against your ear. The kind of silence that carries weight. Then a man's voice broke through. Rough, uncertain, achingly familiar. "Little star, it's me." The world tilted. My knees buckled, hitting the cabinet behind me hard enough to bruise. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but grip that phone like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. "Who?" My voice cracked. "Who is this?" The line went dead, just like that. Silence. I stood there in my dark kitchen, barefoot and spilled coffee, staring at the receiver like it was a loaded gun. My father, Commander Robert Sullivan, United States Navy SEAL, had been declared killed in action off the coast of Norfolk in 2005. 20 years ago, I'd stood beside the flag-draped coffin myself, numb in a black dress that didn't fit right, while 7 Marines fired 3 volleys into the gray Virginia sky. I'd accepted the folded flag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I'd placed a single white rose on the polished wood before they carried it away. I'd buried my father, so who the hell had just called me? By 2:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in my bathrobe, the house still dark except for the soft yellow glow from the stove hood. The old answering machine, one of those relics I kept meaning to replace, blinked red in the corner. One new message. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. Static again. Then that voice. "Little star, it's me. I just figured out who I am." Then nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. I pressed play again, and again, and again, memorizing every crack in that voice, every breath, every impossible word. If this was a cruel prank, someone had done their research. The tone was right. The rhythm was right. Even the slight rasp he'd had from too many cigars in the 90s, it was all there. I whispered into the empty kitchen, "Dad?" Like a fool, like a woman talking to ghosts. When dawn finally came, I drove to the cliff overlook just past Kennebunkport, the one he used to love when he was stationed at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The fog was still thick, rolling in off the Atlantic in great gray waves that swallowed the horizon. He used to bring me here when I was little, before deployments, before the silence between us grew too wide to cross. He'd stand at the edge with his hands in his pockets and say, "The ocean keeps secrets better than people ever could, Maya. That's why sailors trust it more than they trust dry land." For 20 years, I believed one of those secrets was my father's death. He'd been on a classified maritime operation near Norfolk. Underwater communications testing, they said. Experimental tech. Then an explosion. Fire. Total loss of communication. 5 men presumed dead. No bodies recovered. The Navy held a quiet ceremony. A commander I'd never met handed me a folded flag, my father's dog tags, and a letter commending his sacrifice. I'd accepted it as truth. Or at least, I'd trained myself to. Until now, at 9 o'clock sharp, I was standing outside the Bath VA office, still in my coat, hair unbrushed, demanding answers from a young clerk who looked like he'd graduated high school last week. "Ma'am," he said with that polite bureaucratic patience that comes from seeing too many broken people before noon, "the records for 2005 SEAL operations are sealed under the Defense Secrecy Act." "I'm his daughter," I said, voice tight. "And he's calling me." That got a reaction. Not pity. Concern. He printed a form and slid it across the counter. "If you believe you've been contacted by an active or missing service member, fill this out. We'll forward it to Norfolk Command." I wanted to scream. Wanted to grab him by his cheap tie and shake him until he understood that this wasn't a bureaucratic inconvenience, it was my father, calling from the grave. Instead, I took the form. Filled out every blank with shaking hands. Walked out into the cold Maine wind. That night, I called Marcus Cole, one of Dad's old teammates. Cole had retired 8 years ago after his third tour went sideways in Yemen. Now he ran a security consulting firm out of Tampa, spent his days teaching rich executives how to survive kidnappings they'd never experience. His voice was slower now, deeper, but it still carried that military steadiness, the kind that made you believe everything would be okay even when it wasn't. Maya? Surprise thick in his tone. Haven't heard your voice in forever. How's Maine treating you? Cole, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I got a phone call. Yeah? From who? My father. The line went silent, then a sharp exhale. Come again? He called me. At 2 a.m. Said, "Little star, it's me." I could hear him shifting, probably sitting up in whatever chair he'd been lounging in. Maya, you sure it wasn't a wrong number? A prank? Not unless someone studied his voice for 20 years. Cole didn't laugh. Didn't even breathe for a few seconds. You might want to check something for me, he said quietly. You still got his personnel file? Yes. Look at the mission report from 2005. Operation Ironwave. Looked closer at the sign-off. The commanding officer's name. I pulled the file from my desk drawer, flipping through pages I'd memorized years ago. It says Captain D. Reynolds. Yeah, Reynolds wasn't Navy, Maya. He was private contractor security. Hired help. The op got pulled into black budget after the explosion. Whole thing got buried. My stomach dropped. What are you saying? I'm saying your dad might have gotten caught in something off-book. Something they didn't want on record. He's alive. It wasn't a question. I don't know, Cole said carefully. But if that voice came from 757, maybe he's closer than you think. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I pulled out the old cedar box I kept in the closet. The one that held everything I'd saved. His medals, his letters, the Swiss Army knife he'd carried on every mission since Panama. I opened one of the letters, dated August 2004. Written in his blocky, precise handwriting. Maya, if anything ever happens to me, little star, promise me one thing. Don't stop asking questions. Truth has a funny way of hiding in plain sight. Sometimes it takes a stubborn daughter to drag it into the light. Love, Dad. I'd always thought that was just philosophy. A father's way of teaching his daughter to think critically. Now it felt like a treasure map. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I opened my laptop and started searching. Norfolk Unlisted Hospitals 2005 survivors. Missing Veterans Amnesia Cases Virginia. SEAL Classified Explosion Survivors. And that's when I found it. A local blog post from 3 months ago. Unidentified veteran found near Jacksonville shipyard. Suffering memory loss. Claims he used to be somebody important. The man's build. His approximate age, the region code. It was a lead, or maybe just another heartbreak waiting to happen. But either way, I knew what I had to do. I packed a bag, threw it in the trunk of my car, and started driving south. By the time I hit the New Hampshire border, the sun was rising, painting the highway in shades of gold and amber. And I'd already replayed that voicemail 20 times. Each time, my father's voice seemed both clearer and less real, like a song you half remember from childhood. The melody perfect but the words just out of reach. I kept the radio off. I didn't want to drown him out. It had been 20 years since I'd driven this far south. The last time, I was 25. Wearing a black dress. Gripping a folded flag against my chest while the rain soaked through my shoes and the chaplain's voice droned on about duty and honor and sacrifice. Now I was 45, divorced, living alone in a house too big for one person, chasing a ghost down I-95. Every time I passed a military convoy, Humvees in tight formation, young soldiers staring out the back with that 1,000-yard stare that comes from too many deployments, something inside me tightened. Dad had always said, the road is honest, Maya. It gives you time to decide whether you're running towards something or away from it. Right then, I wasn't sure which one I was doing. I reached Norfolk just after sunset. The city hadn't changed much. Same brick warehouses casting long shadows over the harbor. Same gulls circling the cranes like they were guarding something precious. Same smell, salt, diesel, fried food, and history layered so thick you could taste it. I booked a room at a cheap motel near the Naval Yard. The kind with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying wasp and a smell that was equal parts fried shrimp and old cigarettes. When I opened my suitcase, I realized I'd forgotten half my clothes. A toothbrush, deodorant, all the things you pack when you're thinking clearly. I hadn't been planning to stay. But deep down, I knew I wasn't leaving anytime soon. The next morning, I drove to the Norfolk, Virginia regional office. I'd been there once before, years ago, when I'd requested my father's personal effects. They'd handed me a cardboard box containing his dress uniform, a watch that had stopped at 1437, and a photo of the two of us at my college graduation. Nothing else. This time, I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was demanding truth. A middle-aged clerk named Donna, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, took my ID and disappeared into the back. When she returned, she was scrolling through a database on an ancient desktop computer. Commander Robert Sullivan, deceased, 2005, she murmured, eyes scanning the screen. I know what it says, I replied, voice sharper than I intended. But he called me. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. You mean someone pretending to be him? I mean my father. I have the voicemail. She hesitated, studying my face the way nurses look at patients teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Then she said quietly, sometimes we get these cases. Families hearing from lost soldiers. Usually, it's scam artists. Sometimes it's folks with PTSD, convinced they know someone they don't. But, I pressed. But, she leaned closer, voice dropping. 20 years is a long time. A lot of records got sealed after the contractor scandals in the mid-2000s. If you're serious about this, there's one person who might help. She jotted down a name on a post-it note and slid it across the counter. Colonel Michael Reeves, retired, lives near Chesapeake Bay. He was assigned to Iron Wave after the explosion, she added. Off the record, I thanked her, pocketed the note, and stepped outside into air that smelled of salt and diesel and possibilities I wasn't ready to name. That evening, I found Colonel Reeves's address, a small clapboard house near the marshes, weathered shingles and a sagging porch, an American flag still flying despite the wind trying its best to tear it down. He answered the door himself, tall, thin, mid-70s, wearing an old Navy sweatshirt with the anchor insignia faded to almost nothing. Colonel Reeves? I said. That's what they used to call me. His eyes studied me with the intensity of someone trained to assess threats. Then his expression softened. You must be Maya Sullivan. The way he said it, not who are you, but you must be, made my skin prickle. He led me inside without another word, poured 2 mugs of black coffee, and sat across from me at a small kitchen table cluttered with newspapers and maritime charts. I knew your father, he said simply. Robert was one of the best. I swallowed hard. Then maybe you can tell me why he called me last week. He didn't flinch, just stared into his coffee cup like it held answers he wasn't sure I was ready for. You sure it was his voice? Yes. And you're sure you buried him? I folded his flag myself. He nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. You're not crazy, Maya. I'll tell you what I can. What Colonel Reeves told me that night shattered everything I thought I knew. Operation Iron Wave wasn't a standard SEAL op. It was subcontracted through a private defense company, Sentinel Maritime Solutions, to test experimental underwater communication systems. Classified, deniable, the kind of mission that doesn't officially exist. My father was team-led. After the explosion, 5 men were presumed dead. 2 bodies were recovered. Neither was confirmed as Robert Sullivan. The mission report I'd seen, the one that closed the case, had been rewritten. Sanitized. Sealed. Why? I asked, gripping the table. Because there were no survivors to dispute it, Reeves said quietly. Or so we thought. He looked up, eyes weary with decades of carrying secrets. 2 years later, I got a tip from a contractor in Jacksonville. He said a man had been found unconscious near the docks, wearing pieces of a SEAL wetsuit. Had the initials RS stitched inside the collar. My throat tightened, and, when I tried to follow up, the man disappeared from the records. Hospital said he'd been transferred to a private facility. That's where the trail ended. And no one told us. Orders from above. Operational containment, they called it. His jaw tightened. I retired not long after. Couldn't stomach it anymore. I sat there, heart pounding, the sound of distant gulls outside almost deafening in the silence that followed. So he could have been alive this whole time. Reeves sighed. If he was, someone didn't want him found. Back at the motel, I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at my father's photo, the one from his promotion ceremony, standing straight-backed in dress whites, the sun glinting off his silver hair. 20 years later, that smile haunted me. I called Cole again. Reeves confirmed some of it, I said. He thinks Dad survived. Cole's voice dropped low. Then be careful, Maya. If he's alive, that means someone's been hiding him. Those people don't like being found out. I'm not backing off now. I didn't think you would, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. But promise me one thing. If you find him, don't go alone. I promised, though I knew I'd break it. 2 days later, I followed Reeves's lead to Jacksonville. The drive was long, straight roads through endless pines, empty gas stations with hand-painted signs, towns so small they didn't have traffic lights. Somewhere in North Carolina, I stopped at a diner just off the highway. The kind with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that only played country songs from the 80s. The waitress, maybe 60, bleached blonde hair piled high, poured coffee into a chipped mug and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey." I smiled weakly. "Something like that." "Well," she said, nodding at the silver cross I wore around my neck, "if the dead start calling, best thing you can do is listen close. They usually got something left to say." Her words stuck with me the whole rest of the drive. I reached Jacksonville by dusk. The sky bruised purple over the harbor. Seagulls screamed overhead. The air smelled like metal and salt and something older, history, maybe. Or regret. I pulled into the parking lot of a small veterans shelter, the same one from the blog post. A 2-story brick building with peeling paint and a hand-lettered sign that read Harbor House, for those who served. Inside, the manager, an older black woman with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted me warmly. "Looking for someone, baby?" "Yes," I said, voice trembling. "A man who might have stayed here. Maybe used the name Robert. Or Bob." Her eyes softened. "Oh, him. Quiet fella. Lived here on and off for years. Always polite. Always called everyone, sir, or ma'am." My breath caught. "Where is he now?" "Haven't seen him for about a week," she said gently. "Left after a phone call in the middle of the night. Said he had someone to find." The room tilted. I gripped the counter to steady myself. "Did he say where he was going?" "No, sweetheart. But he looked hopeful." Hope. That was something I hadn't felt in 20 years. I spent that first night in Jacksonville staring at the motel ceiling, the hum of the ancient air conditioner mixing with the sound of waves hitting the harbor wall a quarter-mile away. Sleep wasn't an option. I kept seeing his face in flashes, not the strong, clean-shaven seal from my childhood photos, but the man Miss Lorraine had described. Quiet, polite, older, worn down by years of something I couldn't yet name. At dawn, I drove back to Harbor House with 2 coffees and a box of donuts, hoping she might remember more. The sun was barely up, the sky that soft pink that makes even broken streets look gentle. Miss Lorraine was unlocking the front door when I arrived. "Well, good morning, sugar," she said, smiling tiredly. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" "Not really." I handed her a coffee. "Did he ever mention family? A daughter, maybe?" She frowned, thinking. "Once. Maybe twice. He said her name started with an M, called her his little star. Said he used to tell her stories about the sea." My throat closed. "That's me," I whispered. She touched my arm gently. "Then, honey, I think you're close." She told me he used to sit out back by the dock every night, staring at the water like he was waiting for something, or someone, to come save him. "You might try asking at the VA clinic on Bay Street," she added. He'd go there when he wasn't feeling right. Had trouble, I think. The clinic was small, tucked between a pawn shop and a shuttered diner that still had a faded, closed, sign taped to the window. Inside, a tired nurse at the front desk glanced up as I entered. "I'm looking for a man," I said, showing her the faded photo of my father I'd been carrying. "He might have come here over the years. Name's Robert Sullivan." She squinted at the photo. "That face looks familiar. You said he was Navy?" "Yes." She turned toward a filing cabinet, flipping through folders with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "We had a veteran matching that description. Checked in off and on since 2010. Used the name R. Hanley." My pulse spiked. "Where is he now?" "Discharged 2 weeks ago. Said he was heading north." She glanced up. "Said he wanted to see the ocean again before winter." North. Toward me. Driving back toward the coast, I found myself replaying the voicemail again. "Little star, it's me. I just figured out who I am. When I was 6, he'd whisper that every night before turning out the light. He'd tap the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling and say, 'You don't have to be afraid of the dark, kiddo. It's just the sky with the lights turned off.' The last time I heard him say it in person was the day he shipped out for his final mission. I'd hugged him at the base gate, too proud to cry in front of the other families. He'd smiled that crooked smile and said, 'You keep shining, little star.' Always. Now, 20 years later, he was somewhere out there, alive, broken, but calling my name again." By mid-afternoon, I reached the pier Miss Lorraine had mentioned. The docks were quiet except for a few fishermen casting lines and the ever-present gulls fighting over scraps. I sat on a weathered bench, the same one he might have sat on, and stared out at the water. It shimmered like glass, sunlight bouncing off the ripples in a way that made everything look softer than it was. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos. Dad teaching me to tie a bowline knot. Dad holding my bike while I wobbled down the driveway. Dad in his dress whites, grinning at the camera like he owned the world. For 2 decades, those pictures had been all I had left. Now they felt like breadcrumbs. I didn't even realize someone had walked up beside me until I heard a soft voice say, "You looking for Robert?" I turned. It was a middle-aged woman wearing scrubs, her name badge reading Megan Fuller, RN. "I work at the VA clinic," she said. "Miss Lorraine called. Said you were asking about him." "Yes," I said quickly. "Do you know where he went?" She hesitated. "I can't give you addresses. But I can tell you what I remember." She sat down beside me, hands folded in her lap. "He was one of my patients for years. Quiet man, always polite, but lost, you know? Like he was searching for himself and kept coming up empty." Her voice softened. "He had nightmares. Woke up screaming sometimes. About water, fire, and a girl named Maya. Said he'd lost her. Said she'd never forgive him." Tears welled up. "That's me," I whispered. "I'm Maya." She nodded gently, eyes shining. "Then you should know, he talked about you like you were his compass. Said your voice was the only thing that made sense when everything else was gone." Later, Megan showed me his old patient file. The notes were heartbreaking. Possible amnesia, long-term trauma, believes he is a former Navy SEAL, responds strongly to the name Sullivan. And there, in the corner of one page, was a small drawing, a star with 5 uneven points, drawn in shaky pen. Beneath it, in barely legible handwriting, "For my little star." My throat tightened so hard I could barely speak. "When was this drawn?" She flipped through the chart. "About 6 months ago, right before he stopped coming in regularly. We were worried about him. Said he'd started hearing things, phone ringing at night, voices telling him to go home." "Voices?" She nodded. "Sometimes the mind holds on in strange ways. Maybe he was remembering you." That night, I stood at the end of the dock where he'd sat so many times before. The moonlight glowed silver across the water, still and perfect. I took out my phone. Pressed play on the voicemail one more time. "Little star, it's me." For a long moment, I just stood there, the sound of waves filling the silence that followed his words. Maybe it wasn't revenge I was chasing. Maybe it was redemption. For both of us. A soft breeze brushed my hair, and for the briefest second, I could have sworn I heard him whisper, "Don't stop asking questions." That's when I made my decision. I would find him, not through government files, not through old soldiers, but through every shelter, every clinic, every harbor that could hide a man who once commanded oceans. Because he wasn't just a ghost in a phone call. He was my father, and he was calling me home. Chapter 4. Breadcrumbs. It was raining when I reached the address Megan had quietly slipped me, a worn-out veterans housing complex tucked behind a chain-link fence on the edge of the Jacksonville docks. The paint was peeling. The flag out front hung limp in the damp air, more gray than red, white and blue. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the building through the rain-streaked windshield, hands clenched around the steering wheel. If he was inside, I didn't know what I'd say. If he wasn't, I didn't know where else to go. Finally, I forced myself out. The rain was steady but gentle, the kind that makes everything smell like salt and rust and old memory. A thin man with a mop was standing by the door, wearing a maintenance uniform 2 sizes too big. He looked up and nodded. "You looking for someone?" "Robert," I said. "Robert Sullivan. Or, maybe Hanley. I was told he might have stayed here." He scratched his chin. "Bob. Yeah, quiet guy. Stayed here a couple nights last week. Left early one morning. Didn't say where. Paid up front, though. Nice fella. Did he leave anything?" The man shook his head, then frowned like he was remembering something. "Wait, he got a call that night. Middle of the night, maybe 2, 3 in the morning. Came running out of his room afterward. Looked like he'd seen a ghost. Never came back." The world seemed to tilt. "Do you remember what night that was?" He thought for a moment. "About a week ago. Tuesday, I think. That was the same night my phone had rung." I wandered down toward the harbor, rain dripping from my coat, the sky a dull gray that pressed down like a weight. I tried to picture him standing here, older, alone, staring out at the sea the way he used to when I was little. He'd always said the ocean felt like home. "You can lose your way anywhere else, little star," he'd told me once, "but the sea remembers you." I took out my phone and called Cole. "He was here," I said. "Someone saw him. Where is he now?" "I don't know." "Maya." Cole's voice softened. "You sound like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't." "What if he doesn't remember you? What if he's not him anymore?" I was quiet for a long time. Then Cole said, if that happens, you remind him who he was. And if that fails, you forgive him anyway. The next morning, I drove to East Bay's shelter, the last place listed in his VA records. It was a narrow two-story building squeezed between a mechanic's shop and a boarded-up cafe. Inside, a few men sat at a long table eating oatmeal from plastic bowls. The air smelled like disinfectant and wet clothes. A young volunteer, maybe 20, approached me. Can I help you, ma'am? I'm looking for someone, I said. He might go by Bob. Navy veteran. He pointed toward a room at the far end. You might want to ask Sister Margaret. She runs the place. Sister Margaret was sitting behind a small desk, sorting paperwork. She looked up with a smile when I introduced myself. Oh, yes, Mr. Hanley. He's been in and out for years. Good man. Kind eyes. She paused. He left about a week ago. After receiving a phone call. I swallowed hard. Did he say where he was going? Only that he'd finally remembered something important. Said he was heading north to find his daughter. My chest tightened. That's me. She blinked, then slowly smiled. Then I think your prayers are being answered, dear. She opened a drawer, rummaged around, and handed me a folded sheet of paper. He left this behind. Said if anyone came looking, I was to give it to them. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was rough, shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. That blocky print he'd used on grocery lists and birthday cards. Maya, if you ever see this, it means I finally remembered who I am. I don't know what happened all those years ago. I just know I need to see you. If I don't make it, please know I never stopped loving you. You were my little star. And you always will be. Dad. The ink had bled where a raindrop, or maybe a tear, had hit it. I pressed the paper against my chest, breathing hard. Do you know where he went? I asked, voice breaking. She shook her head softly. He mentioned a place called St. Augustine. Said there was something he needed to see there. Something from before. The drive to St. Augustine was 2 hours. But it felt like 10. The rain eased to a mist as I crossed the bridge into the old town. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like curtains. Tourists wandered cobblestone streets, laughing, taking photos, living ordinary lives. I'd been here once with him, years ago, during one of his rare shore leaves. We'd watched the sunset over the old fort and eaten fried shrimp from paper baskets. He'd bought me a tiny brass compass from a gift shop and said, so you can always find your way home. I still had that compass. In my glove box, needle still pointing north. I parked near the old marina and walked along the docks, heart pounding with every step. And then, about 20 yards ahead, I saw him. Sitting on a bench, facing the water, gray hair tucked under a faded navy cap. Shoulders hunched. Even from behind, I knew that posture, the way he always leaned forward slightly, like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. My breath caught in my throat. Dad. He turned slowly. The face that looked back at me wasn't the one I remembered. Older, thinner, lined by years of weather and pain and something darker I couldn't name. But the eyes. Those were his eyes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he whispered, "Little star?" My knees nearly gave out. I stumbled forward, tears blurring my vision. "It's me," I said, voice breaking. "It's really me." He stood, uncertain, trembling, and I saw the scar on his left forearm. The one he'd gotten when I was 10, fixing the fence in our backyard. That was the proof. I threw my arms around him and sobbed. For a second, he froze. Then